Greetings, and welcome to the Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy what you're about to see, and you can find us at the corner of Broadway and Church Streets at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. Or you can find us online at bgmethodist.org and on Facebook at Bowling Green First United Methodist Church.
So we are at kind of the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And that's important for us to remember that Jesus has been spending all this time prior to this, going through a whole lot of things, and now he is bringing it all together at this very end place. Now he hits verse 15, and he talks about you've got to beware of the false prophets, beware of the wolves dressed in sheep's clothing, and it was good that a bunch of us were talking about standing outside earlier, the weird ways that our heads work, because I read that verse and this is what I see. Or worse, that at least looks like a good sheep's costume, because if I were to make a sheep's costume, it'd be like a t-shirt with a bunch of cotton balls with Elmer's glue on them to get them all stuck on there. That's what, that is, kind of this, we all kind of have this intuitive understanding of what Jesus is talking about when he says a wolf in sheep's clothing. But part of me says that, if Jesus were to go and to talk about this passage again today, that he might phrase things a little bit differently. That he may not say wolf in sheep's clothing. He may have this discussion in a different way. It might look like this.
No, it's the hunting season. Sir, in the midst of the hidden forever kingdom, it's wet fever. That season, wet fever. That season, wet fever. That season, wet fever. Wet season, duck fever. Wet season, I play duck fever, and I play fire.
Now, I grew up with Bugs Bunny, and there were a lot of lessons I learned, and maybe not so good ones I learned from him. And I love this. I don't know if you were paying attention. It's taken me several times having watched it now. Right before the very first time that Bugs says "Wabbit season," he opens his eyes up as if to say, "Now watch what I'm going to do here." And then he proceeds to get Daffy into all sorts of trouble. Now this is important, because Bugs is giving us, seems strange to say this about Bugs Bunny, but he is giving us a really good description of what false prophets do today. Of how they kind of get us into the middle of something. But we don't see it very well because we expect that we'll be able to pick out a bad guy or a false prophet out of a group of people, because we expect a false prophet to look more like this. They've got the evil mustache thing, they're twirling it constantly with their fingers. We expect that that's what they're going to look like, and that we'll be able to pick them out of a lineup no problem. That's not the way it works. A false prophet does more like what Bugs did. They'll draw us in and by a statement or doing something because they know how we'll respond. Whether we agree with what they said or not is irrelevant, because they know how we'll respond. And then somewhere in the middle of that, something will happen, and all of a sudden we'll think it's duck season, when we good and well know that it's wabbit season. Or I guess right now it's more archery season for deer, isn't it, Jack? We aren't in either one of them at this point. But they'll have us thinking something completely different. And that's the trouble with false prophets, because they're hard to see, they're hard to pick out, and they'll take us through something, they'll draw us in, they'll know how we'll respond, and then somewhere in the middle of that they'll change it around, and now we'll be saying the complete opposite of what we were before and not know what's going on or how we got there. That's why Jesus has spent all of this time in the Sermon on the Mount trying to get us to be able to figure out what's going on and what that looks like. He says, and Jesus begins to point out to us how we can know good from bad. He begins to point this, to draw this out for us in verse 20. And Jesus says this, he says, "Therefore you will know them by their fruit." And Jesus said, this isn't just any kind of fruit, this is good fruit. This is good fruit, and it's fruit that comes from good trees. But again, so we can know that. And he makes this a whole lot simpler for us. He uncomplicates all of this, because he has just spent the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount uncomplicating things, making things simpler. Because he's gone through all these different places where we get kind of tied tied up into knots, where we get not just tied up into knots, but things are really complicated and we don't know quite what to do. And he spent all of that time undoing all of that stuff and simplifying it and making it less complicated for us to understand. Now notice I didn't say easier. He's not necessarily making it easier. He's not saying this is going to be easy what we're doing, but he's taking the complications out of it, because that's where, more often than not, we get really tied up. We get tied up in the complications of things, because that's what happens. Because the false prophets, the wolves in sheep's clothing, the people that convince us that it's duck season when we know good and well it's wabbit season, they make things more complicated. That's just what they do. They do that because it gives them more power and more authority, and helps them to be able to accomplish their own agendas, and we're left sitting out there trying to figure out, what do we do now? These were the folks that Jesus was talking to, the folks that were just like us. They were trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we get through this complicated maze of stuff in there? Because these were folks that, just like us, didn't have the time or the energy or the resources to have to navigate through a big, long, complicated set of things. Because at Jesus' time, they had their rules, and then they had the subparagraphs for the rules, and they had the subsections for the subparagraphs for the rules. I mean, you could keep going down farther on that list. And they had these great big flow charts of, well, if you did this, and you got to do here, if you did that, then you got to kind of go back and really, kind of draw them around in all of this mess of stuff that they were trying to make sense of and to work through, and they just didn't have the time or the energy or the resources to do it. And Jesus is telling them, you don't have to. It doesn't have to be that complicated. In fact, it's not that complicated. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it's not that complicated. That was the message that Jesus has been working on getting through all of this time. Now we can kind of summarize what Jesus has been saying in the Sermon on the Mount. Now Jesus didn't summarize it in this way, but John Wesley many years later did this in what he called the general rules. Now he says it's got this big, official name. A few years ago, there's a gentleman who wrote a book based on those, called them 3 Simple Rules, because that's what they are. And they summarize what Jesus was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, and they pull us to a place where we can better understand what's going on and work through what we face. The first of those was, do no harm. It's a good place to start. Do no harm. Whatever it is that's going on, if we see if it's doing harm, then maybe we need to rethink what's going on. The second of those rules is, do all the good you can. Now, nowhere in there is there a minimum requirement of good that we are supposed to do. There is no minimum height requirement to get onto this ride. The definition that that John Wesley gives us says, how much good should you do? All that you can. And that looks different at different points in our lives. There are some times where I know, and you know, that the amount of good that we can do is maybe about that much, because our kids or our co-workers or our family members or our friends are pulling on that one last nerve, and that's about all the space we got left. Sometimes that's what happens. Other times, maybe we've got this much space. That is the good that we can do. And that's what Jesus asks of us is, how much good can you do? Do that. And the third rule then is stay in love with God. Now, John Wesley had a much more traditional English way of saying this. He said, he put it this way, he said, attend upon all the ordinances of God. When Reuben Job wrote his book, 3 Simple Rules, he paraphrased it a little bit down to this, stay in love with God. That gets us, I think, better at Jesus' intent in the Sermon on the Mount. Stay in love with God. Find ways of doing that. And again, that's something that's going to be different for each of us wherever we are, because we're all different. What it means for me to love God is different from what it means for one of y'all to love God. We can come together at times like this and do that together, but we all have our own ways of getting there. That's the thing. That's the last part of it. It really is that simple. Like I said, that doesn't mean that's easy, but it's that simple. And our goal is to do this, is to try and do this. We don't have to be perfect at it. We don't have to get this right all the time, but we can try. And so long as we are trying and we are working in that direction, we can produce good fruit because because it is based on a good tree. It is based on a solid teaching that comes from Christ. It is based on what it is that he has built inside of us and on everyone around us. And then there's one last part of this that Jesus takes us into. And he takes us into kind of the last part of this Sermon on the Mount, what is it that we are building our house on? What kind of foundation? He says, do this. Build it on good, firm, solid bedrock. Or build it on rock and not sand. Because this is what's important. This is what Jesus is giving us to build on, is that solid rock that can stand through the craziness that our lives can be at times. They can withstand all of that, and not just withstand the craziness of life, but also lets us still be able to produce good fruit. Because that is what Jesus gives to us. That is the gift he gives. And we've got one last part of this. The closing words, we get the crowd's response to Jesus' message. And it goes like this. When Jesus finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he was teaching them like someone with authority, not like their legal experts. This was huge. Because remember, the folks that Jesus was teaching had never heard anyone teach like Jesus taught. They were used to having their religious leaders who were also legal experts, and when they taught, they could do so based on, here's this set of rules over here, here's this, and then they would say, well, here's this group of character witnesses that I can pull in that will verify everything that I've been saying, and then they'll say, and here's this other group of folks that have been writing all these detailed legal opinions about what's going on. You can trust what we say because we have verified it all. It is all right here. And Jesus taught them differently. He didn't need all the character witnesses or all the legal opinions or any of that other stuff. In fact, you look at the people that surrounded Jesus. He had his disciples over with him, and they were there mostly for logistical support and to learn. Because most of those folks wouldn't have been given any sort of authority prior to their association with Jesus, because they wouldn't have had the needed knowledge. And yet here Jesus is standing on his own, teaching with authority, because the way he taught, quite literally, when the folks were hearing it, they could feel the truth in his words. Because they knew what everything else was doing to them, the way that it was kind of tearing them up and twisting them into knots, and the complications that it added to their lives as they were trying to understand it. And here Jesus is speaking in very simple yet easy to understand ways, and it was undoing all of those knots, all of those worries, all of those fears, all of those concerns. And when he taught, something clicked inside of them, and they said, I get this, I understand this. Finally, someone is talking to me in a way that I can hear. That was Jesus' authority for what he was doing. The way he taught, the way he spoke, the way he could reach folks in ways that didn't tie them up and don't tie us up, but free us to be who he is intended for us to be. And now it's not just the crowd's response that they say Jesus speaks with authority, but I think Matthew also includes that in there because he says this is a commission and a call for us to go forward. Every year at annual conference, all the clergy who are being ordained at conference get up, and the bishop will say to them at one point in the service, he'll tell them this, he'll say, take thou authority. Saying to them, you've had all this education, you've had all this experience, you've been through all this other stuff. Now it's time to really take what you have learned and take that the next step and go out into the world and take that authority by which you've been taught and take that out into a world that needs to hear that message. And the same holds true for us today. That we have been taught, we can learn, we have grown, we can produce that good fruit, but now it's time for us to take that same authority and go out into a world that needs to hear that message, needs to hear that good news, needs to hear that word that says it doesn't have to be complicated, but here is a truth, here is a foundation that you can build on, here is the way that you can produce good fruit, here's what you can do and who you can be because of the foundation that comes in Jesus Christ and the way he teaches as one with authority, not for everything else, but because something inside of us responds to the truth of his words and says, yes, we can do this, we can be these people. Let's go the next days and weeks to come and take our authority and go into a world and share that message of hope and good news and promise for the world that needs to hear it. Amen.